Young Lieutenant Roger looked with disdain at the 74-year-old man who had just arrived at the naval base. The stealth destroyer USS Zumwalt DDG-1000 had been out of service for days, and the best technicians had failed to fix the problem. When Roger learned that this man had come to repair the ship, his pride got the best of him, and he arrogantly fired off. "Our best technicians failed, and you think you'll work a miracle, Grandpa?" What Roger didn't realize was that, as he barked out his words, Admiral Russell was approaching with steady steps. An admiral who trusted this man completely to solve the problem on the ship he commanded. The sound of the admiral's footsteps on the concrete pier surrounding the USS Zumwalt broke the brief silence after the provocation. Young Lieutenant Roger, still leaning slightly forward with a furrowed brow, didn't immediately notice someone approaching. Sean Adams stood still, his gaze fixed on the ship as if he were looking at an old friend. Roger didn't know it, but Sean had been a longtime friend of Admiral Russell since their days serving together, a man the Admiral had turned to in missions where a single mistake could cost lives. "Lieutenant?" The deep voice came before Roger had time to fully turn around. He straightened his posture instantly. "Sir." Russell stopped in front of them, his voice carrying a weight that needed no shouting. "What the hell are you doing yelling at Sean Adams?" A few sailors moving around the pier slowed their pace, pretending to busy themselves with ropes and equipment, but keeping their ears on the conversation. I was just saying that," Roger began, hesitating. "This man," Russell cut in firmly, "knows more about ships than you or anyone you've ever met. He was instrumental in developing the Zumwalt's engines, and if he's here, it's because I personally asked him to be." Roger blinked as if trying to process the words. This didn't match the image in front of him. A simple-looking older man in worn clothes, not wearing a uniform, carrying an ordinary set of tools. Sean, unaffected by the lieutenant's discomfort, kept his eyes on the ship and spoke for the first time. "The problem's still in the fuel system, like you mentioned on the phone?" "Seems so. Critical sensor showing a pressure fault." Russell gestured for them to follow. "They've replaced it twice and nothing's changed." "Then let's have a look." Sean picked up the toolbox from his car and started walking alongside the hull toward the gangway. As they moved, Roger stayed a few steps behind, torn between curiosity and wounded pride. In his mind, the equation was simple. If highly trained engineers hadn't solved it, it made no sense to think a 70-something man, no matter how experienced, could work a miracle. Roger had graduated with honors from the Naval Academy, held a master's in mechanical engineering, and commanded a team of 15 specialized technicians. The idea that this man could succeed where they had failed felt like a personal insult to his competence. The Zumwalt structure loomed above them like a wall of gray steel, its angular lines reflecting the sunlight. There were no decorative elements, only an aggressive, minimalist design built to vanish from radar. The pier was busy, sailors unloading crates, technicians trying to figure out what was wrong with the ship. Still, there was something different in the air. Sean's presence seemed to change the way some eyes turned toward the group. They reached the base of the gangway and climbed up. Roger noticed Sean didn't waste time on unnecessary remarks, but scanned every detail along the way. The hiss of valves, the vibration in the deck. It was as if each of these signs told him a story no one else could hear. Inside the engine compartment, the trio was met by the ship's chief engineer, a serious-faced man named McAllen. Roger crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. The air inside was warmer, thick from the work of auxiliary machines. A faint, constant hum came from a side panel, while the irregular buzz of a fan completed the atmosphere of a ship on standby. "I want to see the fuel system up close," Sean said. McAllen, visibly skeptical, obeyed after the Admiral gave a nod of approval. They passed through even narrower corridors, where pipes and cables ran along the ceiling and walls. Fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over metal surfaces marked by years of use. The sound of boots against the steel floor mixed with distant echoes of voices and tools. When they reached the main section, Sean stopped for a moment. The engine line was silent, like a machine forced into sleep. "Before we touch anything, I want the complete failure log for the last few days," he said. Roger, standing behind them, let out an audible sigh, but the Admiral, still close, said nothing. Sean wasn't in a hurry, and somehow that inspired confidence, even if Roger wouldn't yet admit it to himself. While McCallan pulled up the reports, Sean took a small notebook from the inside pocket of his jacket. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, quick diagrams, and crossed-out numbers. He flipped through until he found what he was looking for, checked it, and slipped the notebook back into his pocket. McCallan pulled up the failure log on the screen. Lines of code and automated entries filled the monitor, each one stamped with the time, date, and affected parameter. To an untrained eye, it was just a string of blinking numbers. To Sean, it was like reading a silent diary of everything the ship had been through over the past few days. He stepped closer, leaning forward, scanning the columns of data. From time to time, he pointed at something with his finger but didn't explain right away. He jotted down a few numbers in his notebook, crossed one out, went back a few entries, compared them. Roger, still standing with his arms crossed, made no effort to hide his impatience. Every minute without action felt to him like a waste of time. But there was something telling. Admiral Russell and McCallan showed no frustration. On the contrary, they moved at Sean's pace as if they knew this was the right way to make progress. "The shutdowns don't follow a fixed pattern," Sean finally said. "It's not operating time, not temperature, and it doesn't seem to be actual pressure. It's in the sensor reading, but something's interfering with the signal." McCallan nodded slightly in agreement. "And we haven't been able to pinpoint the interference," he added. "Every time we measure, it comes out normal." Sean looked toward the compartment on the right. There, a series of ducts and connections led to the heart of the fuel system. The area was partially closed off with safety panels, requiring tools to remove. "I want to see inside," he said, pointing. McCallan signaled to one of the nearby technicians, who grabbed a set of wrenches and began loosening the fastenings. When the panels came off, they revealed a space filled with sealed components. A bundle of shielded cables ran tight along a metal block with a main connector. Sean stepped closer, lighting the area with a small pocket flashlight. His fingers lightly traced the surface, following the path of the cables to a spot where the outer casing looked just slightly different, almost imperceptible, except to someone who knew what to look for. He said nothing. He simply straightened up and asked, "I want the maintenance manual open to this section. And bring me the parts replacement log for the last year." McCallan began entering commands, while another technician brought over a tablet with the records. Roger watched, his discomfort growing. With every step, Sean seemed less like a visitor and more like the silent one in command. The manual appeared on the screen, showing detailed diagrams and disassembly instructions. Sean studied it for a few seconds before asking, "These parts here, did they all come from the same batch?" he said, pointing to the assembly connected to the fuel sensor. The technician checked the log and replied, "Yes, all received 6 months ago, same supplier." Sean didn't comment, but Roger noticed a slight raise of his eyebrows. The silence that followed wasn't uncertainty. It was focus. "I need to see the whole ship from the pier," Sean said, breaking the moment. "I want to confirm something." No one questioned him. They made their way back through the corridors and up to the deck. The cold, damp morning air hit them as they stepped outside, carrying the salty scent of the sea and the distant cries of seagulls. Sean walked to the rail and looked over the hull, as if mentally mapping the position of every compartment inside. Roger, still skeptical, began to notice that this walk wasn't a waste of time. There was method in every move. This wasn't guesswork. It was a calculated sequence of observations. "Lieutenant," Admiral Russell said quietly as he came closer to Roger, "do you still think he's here to work a miracle?" Roger didn't answer. He simply kept his eyes on Sean, who was now heading back into the ship with the same calm as before. Back in the technical area, Sean requested a complete shutdown of some auxiliary systems. The order was carried out, and the ambient noise shifted, revealing faint sounds that had been masked by the constant hum. He knelt down, leaning his ear toward a specific point, as if listening to the metal itself breathe. "I want to run a test now, but at low load. No activating the main systems. McCallan gave the orders and the control panel began to come to life. Readings appeared on the screen, and Sean watched without blinking. At every slight variation, he quickly jotted down notes in his book. Roger, despite himself, could no longer hide his interest. Something was about to come to light, and he wanted to see it. Sean then closed his notebook, slipped it back into his pocket, and said, with the same calm he had maintained from the start, "All right, I know where to start." He asked for the system to remain on standby and walked over to a workbench in the corner, opening his tool case. Roger realized the mood in the room had shifted. McCallan and his team were no longer just accompanying an old veteran. They were waiting for instructions from someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. And for the first time, Roger felt it might be better to listen than to speak. Sean pulled out a small case from his kit, neatly divided into precise compartments, clean, well-kept tools, each marked with almost invisible signs. He first selected a portable multimeter, then a set of precision screwdrivers, and finally, a neatly folded cotton cloth. "McCallan, I want you to shut down only the secondary circuit of the fuel system. Keep the primary in standby mode," Sean said while adjusting the multimeter. "Understood," the chief engineer replied, signaling to his team. The sound of relays powering down was followed by a brief silence. The screen lights dimmed into power-saving mode, and the room took on a sense of controlled pause. Sean crouched beside the main connector of the fuel sensor. He lit the area with his pocket flashlight, revealing tiny specks of metallic dust around the edges. It wasn't something that would catch the eye immediately, but Sean examined it as if recognizing a pattern. "This isn't regular dirt," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. With steady movements, he began a sequence of measurements. He touched the multimeter probes to specific points, noted the readings in his notebook, shifted position, repeated. With each result, his expression stayed neutral, but there was a spark in his eyes that Roger was starting to recognize. This was not a man taking a chance. This was someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "This component operates right at the tolerance limit when exposed to temperature variations outside standard operating range," Sean said, almost as if reminding himself aloud. Roger, watching closely, couldn't resist. "And what exactly does that mean?" Sean glanced at him briefly, without the slightest trace of impatience. "It means sometimes the problem isn't in what the machine says, but in what it can't tell you." He went back to work. Taking a precision screwdriver, he began loosening the connector. The screws, with a touch of oxidation at the edges, resisted slightly before giving way. Removing the part revealed the base where the contact pins met the internal wiring. The flashlight's beam caught a faint greenish tint on one of the contact points. McCallan leaned in for a better look. "It's not much, but it shouldn't be there." Sean nodded but said nothing. He took out the cotton cloth, a small bottle of cleaner, and began working on the pins with short, controlled motions. As he cleaned, Sean said, "Bring me the spare part you've got in storage. I want to compare it." One of the technicians left quickly and returned with a sealed box. Sean opened it, took out the new part, and, before making any swap, examined it with the same meticulousness. He checked the pin alignment, the resistance of the fittings, even the shine of the metal alloy. Then he placed it on the workbench beside the old one. Roger moved closer, curious. The two sensors looked practically identical. To an untrained eye, there was nothing unusual. But Sean noticed something. The new part had an extra protective layer on the connector. A tiny detail, but enough to show it came from a different batch. "McCallan, this one isn't from the same batch as the last ones you used, is it?" "No, this one came in last week." Sean gave a brief nod of confirmation. He went back to cleaning the original connector but stopped before reinstalling it. Instead, he began manually preparing the new part, as if making sure it would fit perfectly. Roger crossed his arms, trying to keep the posture of someone who was just observing, but it was clear he wanted to understand the reasoning. "You're not going to test it first?" he asked. "Not yet," Sean replied. "First, I want to make sure everything around it is in ideal condition." He went to the base where the system's cables ran, checked their fittings, tightened a few loose screws, repositioned a support that was vibrating slightly. Each move seemed small, but McAllen watched closely. He knew that, together, these adjustments were critical. When he finished, Sean took a deep breath and looked at the panel. Let's run the low-load test again, but now with the new sensor installed. No rush to reach final RPM. The swap was made. The new part clicked into place smoothly. The technicians reconnected the cables, and McAllen gave the order to start the procedure. The panel lit up and the readings began to appear. At first, everything looked the same as in the previous test. Roger kept his eyes on the numbers, waiting for the moment the faults would show. But Sean wasn't watching the numbers. He was listening to the system's sound, observing barely noticeable vibrations in the pipes, and feeling the temperature around the connector with his hand. "Hold it there," Sean said, raising his hand. McAllen paused the process. Sean went back to the sensor and made a small manual adjustment to its fitting. A soft, metallic click echoed. Only then did he step back and signal to continue. The test resumed, and this time the panel's reading stayed stable for longer than before. Roger could tell something was changing, though he wasn't yet sure if it was definitive. Sean, however, closed his tool case, looked at McAllen and said, "It's ready for the next step." And then, without revealing what would come next, he walked toward the door, leaving Roger and the entire team with a mix of expectation and uncertainty. The silence in the engine room was almost tangible. Everyone waited for Sean's final call as he stood by the door, watching the control panel from a distance. The partial test had gone well, but the Zumwalt still wasn't ready to sail. "McAllen, let's run the engine at full power," Sean finally said. "I want to see if it holds all the way to the operational limit." The chief engineer nodded and began directing his crew. Roger, now more focused than ever, stayed close to the main panel, his eyes shifting between the readings and Sean. The systems came to life gradually. First, a deep, contained rumble. Then, a slow but steady climb until the sound grew into the rich, resonant roar everyone there knew well. The deck vibrated beneath their feet. The indicator needles held steady without a flicker. "Fuel pressure is stable," a technician announced, almost in disbelief. "No alarms triggered." Sean walked over to the connector, running his hand lightly over the metal block, as if confirming by touch what the numbers already showed. Then he looked at McAllen. "Hold it at this RPM for 10 minutes. If it doesn't drop, the ship's ready." Time passed slowly, the sound of the engines filling every corner of the room. When the timer reached the mark, McAllen gave a slight smile and a thumbs up. "It's perfect." There were no cheers, no overblown celebrations, just a quiet sense of relief spreading through the crew. For Sean, it was another job done. For the others, it was a masterwork completed by someone who truly understood his craft. Sean picked up his tool case, tucked it under his arm, and gave a brief nod to Admiral Russell, who had been waiting at the doorway. The Admiral returned a look of gratitude that needed no words. Roger, meanwhile, stayed frozen in place. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was the realization that his initial attitude had been a serious mistake. Up on deck, Sean walked toward the gangway. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, painting the water in golden and orange reflections. Admiral Russell followed him to the base of the gangway. "You saved our week, Sean, maybe even more than that." Sean gave a small, quiet smile. "I just did what I've always done, Russell. The ship needed to get out and I needed to help." They walked down to the pier together. Waiting there was Sean's 1972 Ford Galaxy. He opened the door, set his tool case on the passenger seat, and settled behind the wheel. The Galaxy's engine gave a low, steady growl as Sean eased it out of the base parking lot. In the background, the Zumwalt's engines kept their deep, commanding rumble. It was almost as if the two sounds were in conversation, one a symbol of experience, the other of power. Minutes later, the destroyer began moving away from the pier. Cables were reeled in, and the massive vessel slid across the water with a smoothness that belied its size and strength. From the deck, Roger watched as the ship steadily gained distance from the Ford Galaxy. As the sea opened before the USS Zumwalt and the setting sun lit the horizon, A weight settled in his chest, the weight of acknowledging his mistake. Roger understood. Understood that respect isn't asked for, bought, or imposed by age or rank. It's earned in silence, because respect is like a bright light that cuts through the darkness of intolerance. And on that day, it shone across the deck of that ship. And if you also believe that respect should be part of every stage of our lives, write respect in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.